Is now 12:15. It's Thursday the 18th of June and session 2 part 6 of this first compulsory acquisition hearing is now open. In this session we will be looking at site-specific compulsory acquisition or CA issues pertaining to the former Wisley Airfield site. My name is Gavin Jones. I'm the lead member of the panel of the examining inspectors appointed by the Secretary of State for the application made by Highways England for an order granting development consent for the M25 Junction 10 A3 Wisley Interchange project. I shall just now let the other member of the panel introduce himself to you.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Graham Gould and I'm the other member of the Examination Authority.
Thank you, Mr. Gould. I should keep this brief for two reasons. Firstly, because I appreciate that some people might need to go fairly soon. And secondly, because Mr. Humphreys and a number of other people have already heard this 6 times. So this will be the 7th time he's heard something or a variation on this theme. So I won't go on too much.
I really enjoy it, sir. It's great to see if it's the same every time.
I'll say no more and leave it there, but I appreciate we do have a couple of people joining us today that are inverted commas newbies, so we'll have to do a bit of the spiel. First of all, thank you all for attending and for all your help in accommodating the additional steps that have been required for us to run this in a virtual hearing format. As we've been saying all along, in Touchwood, we haven't had too many technical glitches, but let's not rule that out. There is the possibility. And things just are slower in this virtual world. There are more delays, and so please bear with us. It does take a bit of time to get plans on screen, although Mr. Price, who's been doing the screen sharing with us, has been brilliantly efficient so far. As Ms. Church probably said in the arrangements conference, if you can keep your microphones off unless we ask you to speak, it just cuts down on the background noise, stops some of the interference and feedback. So if I could just get turn to the introductions. If I get the applicant side to introduce themselves first, probably just Mr. Humphreys at this point, and anybody else from Highways England will be taking the lead on this this session this afternoon. Mr. Humphreys, please.
Yes, sir. Michael Humphreys, barrister again for Highways England. So I don't think there'll be a need for a lot of others to contribute for us during this session, but I think possibly Mr. Wade, who you've heard from several times before, the project director. So we'll see how we go. But I've also got Mr. Lucchini and others available if they're needed. Okay,
thank you very much, Mr. Humphreys. Okay, then turning to the Wisley Property Investments Limited, Taylor Wimpey and Gately. Is it Hamer or Hammer? Hamer, I'm going to say.
Good afternoon, Ian Cunliffe, Gately Hamer.
Okay, Mr. Cunliffe, if you could introduce yourself, please, and then I'll take it in turns for the rest of the Wisley. I should call you collectively the Wisley Airfield people, if that's okay today. So first of all yourself, and then the rest of the Wisley Airfield people, please.
That sounds suitably friendly. Good afternoon, Ian Cunliffe on behalf of Gately Hamer. I'm a chartered surveyor acting on behalf of Taylor Wimpey. By way of background, Taylor Wimpey UK Limited acquired Wisley Property Investments Limited in March 2020 of this year. We also have with us Lee Davis, who's a technical director for major projects for Taylor Wimpey.
Do you want to introduce everybody, or shall I get just to check everybody's microphones are working? It's probably best if I just get everybody to go through. Mr. Cunliffe, I've got the list. So the next person on my list who's signed in to be here today is Mr. Murray. You'll need to turn your microphone. Mr. Murray, if you can just turn your microphone on, please. Still can't hear you. Can you unmute yourself? On the toolbar, you should see a microphone. We still can't hear you, Mr. Murray. Have you unmuted yourself? Put your thumbs up to us if you have. Yes, I see a nodding of a head. Okay, that is My colleague is just saying that you haven't managed to unmute yourself. Unfortunately, once we've muted you, we can't unmute you. You have to unmute yourself. There's a toolbar and there's a picture of a microphone on it. You've done that. I can see you're smiling and being very patient with us. Okay,
we're clearly seeing on screen that you are still muted. There is a bar through the little mic by the side of your name.
Okay, well, let's hope we don't have to run this session through the medium of mime. We've gone so brilliantly so far as well. Apart from a few technical glitches, we've not had anybody drop out. But the case team will be in contact with Mr. Murray, and what we'll try and do is get Mr. Murray back, even if it's only in a audio rather than a video form. Well, that's a great start. But I'll move on to Mr. Pazaru, please.
Hi there, good afternoon. Not sure if you can see and hear me.
We can. Thank you, Mr. Pazaru. I'm pleased to say.
Hello there. Adonis Pazaru from Taylor Wimpey. I'm one of the project managers working for Taylor Wimpey.
Thank you very much. I'll come back to Mr. Murray at the very end. Next, I've got Mr. Davis.
Hello there. Good afternoon. My name's Lee Davis, and I'm the project director from Taylor Wimpey Major Developments.
Good afternoon, Mr. Davis. You're loud and clear, I'm pleased to say. And I've got Mr. Courage.
Yeah, hello, my name is Rafe Courage. I'm a solicitor for Gately PLC, and I act for Wisley Property Investments Limited, also Taylor Wimpey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Courage. Okay, hopefully second time lucky, Mr. Murray.
Good afternoon, sir. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Yes, so I was unmuted, but regrettably there was clearly a technical error, as sometimes does happen in Teams. So I've left the conference and rejoined. So Mike Murray, Chartered Surveyor. I'm a consultant acting on behalf of Taylor Wimpey and appointed by Whipple. I've been involved in the site since 2006 on its purchase from previous owner. So hence my continued involvement.
Thank you, Mr. Murray. Glad that we can hear from you finally. As I said, we've gone almost 3 days with very few, and unbelievably very few technical glitches. One point I would raise, and Mr. Humphries has had to do it a few times, if the audio link gets really bad, then sometimes it's easier to take off the video camera, turn it off, because that seems to increase the bandwidth, and then we can tend to hear people more clearly. So that's the first solution to try. But if you do start to break up, we will let you know. Okay, and as Mr. Murray's just done, if you do lose your connection at any point, please rejoin using the joining instructions that you were given. If you're not able to rejoin using the web address, then please try the telephone number. But hopefully, fingers crossed, everything will be okay. A recording is being made of today's hearing. This will be the formal record of the hearing. And if you participate in the hearing today, you consent to being recorded. You're representing organisations, so you shouldn't be disclosing any personal information, but please be aware that the general data protection regulations do apply. We will be doing a little bit of document sharing potentially today. Please bear with us with that. It will only be done by Mr. Gould, myself, or most probably Mr. Price, though. If there are any documents that you wish to share that are in the examination library, please let us know. We'll endeavour to bring them up. It does take a bit of time, but Mr. Price has been ruthlessly efficient so far in doing that. And anybody who speaks today, please provide a written summary of your oral representations with the rest of the post-hearing documents you may wish to submit. That's the next deadline, which is deadline 11, Friday the 3rd of July. Thank you. Are there any questions? There's a bit of a rush through, but most of you have heard this a number of times already. Are there any questions about the agenda or anything I've said so far? Silence and or a shaking of head is good. If you do wish to attract our attention at any time, then probably the easiest thing is on your toolbar. You'll see there's a raise your hand function. That's a good way of getting Mr. Gould or my attention. But if there's nothing at the moment, I shall turn to Mr. Gould and agenda item 2, please.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. So turning to agenda item 2, I'd like to invite the airfield people, in inverted commas, to give your summary of your case in not more than 5 minutes, setting out why you consider that the compulsory acquisition and temporary possession powers sought by the applicant would not be appropriate, having regard to the provisions of the Planning Act 2008 and the government's guidance concerning compulsory acquisition. Mr. Cunliffe, is this something you're going to lead on, or somebody else from the team?
Good afternoon, Ian Cunliffe, Gately Hamer. Yes, I will be leading on this. We'll be looking for input from other members of the team as I progress through our statement or post my statement. Would you like me to continue?
Yeah, please proceed.
Thank you. So by way of background, Wisley Property Investments Limited, or known colloquially as Whipple, is an affected persons and has multiple plots affected by the scheme, primarily comprising land formerly used as an airfield and now being the largest part of a prospective residential-led development site of approximately 2,100 new homes and allocated as such in the Guildford local plan. We've already touched on this, but Whipple was acquired by Taylor Wimpey UK Limited in March 2020, and I will refer to the owners of the airfield as Whipple through this statement. The plots affected by the scheme and included in the book of reference are plots 118, 122 and 25B, which are all subject to title acquisition, i.e. pink land. The temporary possession land being green over plots 21, 21A, 21B, 23, 25A and 25C, and permanent rights are with temporary possession of sought over plots 140 and 118A. We can talk further as identified as an agenda item on negotiations later on in the process, but by brief background, we provided engagement with the applicant in the statement of common ground submitted at deadline 6, which is reference Rep 6009, and Whipple provided an update at deadline 7 submission being Rep 7030. It has been the stated intention of both parties to enter into a side agreement or land and works agreement to ensure that key concerns that Whipple have regarding the airfield are resolved to allow Whipple to withdraw its objection to compulsory acquisition powers. However, the exchange of the draft document has not resulted in substantial progress, and key outstanding concerns remain, which means that Whipple cannot at this stage remove its objection. For the benefits of this hearing, we reference paragraph 25 of the guidance, which says applicants should seek to acquire land by negotiation wherever practicable. As a general rule, authority to acquire land compulsorily should only be sought as part of an order granting development consent if attempts to acquire by agreement fail. Highways England has stated its intention to seek to agree the land and rights sought in the DCA by private treaty, as per the statement of reasons. However, progress of late has slowed to a stall, and at this stage of the examination, this works to Whipple's significant disadvantage. It is Whipple's experience that there have not been genuine efforts to attempt to secure the rights needed by private agreement, and thus resolve the concerns and issues of Whipple in accordance with guidance. I now turn to the specific concerns that we would like to see addressed. Specific issue 1 is the use of the powers in the order. Whipple is willing to agree to the implementation of compulsory acquisition powers for the land required permanently by the applicant and has agreed that this land can indeed be vested. However, Whipple is concerned over the use and occupation of all land included in the order on a temporary basis, particularly during construction. Whipple has requested that all land in the DCO is occupied temporarily prior to vesting, and controls are put in place, by way of a licence we have suggested, over the occupation of the order land. This approach would ensure that the applicant only acquires permanent land it needs once the infrastructure is in place, thus demonstrating proportionality, and provides Whipple with comfort on how the parties will interface during the construction phase of the scheme, whilst ensuring that the reinstatement requirements are identified from the outset. Our second key concern is the Wisley Lane access, which is in particularly relevant to plots 118, 122 and plot 25B. The site currently benefits from an existing, albeit periodically used, access off Elm Lane and a consented, implemented but not constructed access off the Ockham roundabout. Both of these accesses would be removed as a result of the DCO, and Whipple is relying on one or both of them to deliver its scheme. The site's other access off Ockham Lane is not considered suitable by Surrey County Council for construction of the residential development at Wisley Airfield. The diverted Wisley Lane access is critical for Whipple to access the airfield site both during construction and once the scheme is operational. In recent negotiations, the applicant has not been able to agree that access will not be severed to the airfield during construction, and that access could be severed for an undefined period of time. This is unacceptable to Whipple, who will have a significant construction programme that will be running in parallel with the applicants in order to deliver the housing in accordance with the adopted local plan and to deliver the local housing trajectory. Wisley Airfield is an important component of the council's plan to deliver housing to meet their need in this period. Whipple has requested that the realigned Wisley Lane accommodates any realigned utilities, such as the gas main and the fibre optic cable, to ensure that they take into account the potential of long-term access requirements and use of the developed airfield. This remains outstanding despite Whipple's attempts to address the concerns in the side agreement. Whipple has also sought to agree the environmental permeability of the new Wisley Lane to mitigate the impact on land that will be severed by the scheme, but the applicant has failed to engage meaningfully on this matter. Whipple's position remains that key aspects of the design of the Wisley Lane realignment should be agreed now to ensure that it is appropriate for the construction and operation of the airfield site. Given that a contractor is now on board, this should be achievable, and Whipple does not accept that these matters are ones that should be postponed to be unilaterally determined by Highways England outside of the examination. Specific issue 3 is the use of the compound area, which are plots 2.1, 2.1a, 2.1b, 2.3, 2.5a and 2.5c. Proposed change 9 submitted by the applicant at deadline 6 detailed the anticipated use of the compound area. Whipple has no in principle objection to the use of the land as a compound, but the introduction of a materials processing, traffic management and welfare facilities on the site means that the site has become a key strategic site for the entire construction programme. It has been Whipple's position that the site should be yielded up at the earliest opportunity, and in any event no later than 2 months following open for traffic, to allow for the timely demobilisation of the compound to prevent stymieing and or delaying the proposed development of the airfield, with the potential to phase the handback of the compound as areas become vacant. However, given the proposed changes, it is now critical to ensure that there is an agreement on shared access or separate access provision for use by Whipple's contractors to obtain access to the airfield site for the proposed residential development during the period of the DCO works and following grant of planning consent for the airfield development. Agreement on this is essential for Whipple to be confident that Highways England will not prejudice the timely development of the airfield, along with an agreement on the appropriate junction arrangements for the site. Further, the long-term uses that are now suggested for the compound risk adversely affecting use of critical land for the development of the airfield, in particular joining land that has been identified for phased use as suitable alternative natural green space or SANG. This will likely form a condition of any planning consent for the airfield, and users' enjoyment of it will need to be free from impacts such as noise and dust, etc., from the material processing that would detract from the use and enjoyment of the SANG and other land uses. It is therefore absolutely essential that the practical arrangements alongside the commercial terms for use of the compound site are confirmed in an agreement for Whipple to be confident that development of the airfield will not be prejudiced. In the latest markup of the agreement issued by the applicant surveyor had not provided any input to the terms for the licence, and there was no certainty over timescales for the yielding up of the compound area, which is absolutely critical for Whipple. This is unacceptable to Whipple given the proposals for the airfield and prejudices bringing forward this key strategic development. Key issue 3, reinstatement provisions of methods of working. Whipple has included a methods of working schedule to be appended to the side agreement, which would ensure that there were controls over how land would be used, not least to ensure appropriate and acceptable health and safety and construction practicality matters are addressed, and how the land will be reinstated in accordance with Article 14 of the DCO to the reasonable satisfaction of the landowner. The majority of the schedule has been challenged by the applicant in the latest markup of the documents, with the suggestion that there are sufficient safeguards in the DCO and that Whipple should rely on the compensation provisions therein. This represents too great a risk to Whipple, and all has been sought is contractual certainty on commitments made in the DCO, and to ensure that matters are addressed now rather than being left for interpretation and dispute during construction. Of particular concern are the works to Stratford Brook, being plots 140 and 118 in the Book of Reference. It has been agreed in principle that the arrangements for the ongoing maintenance of Stratford Brook can be adopted by Whipple, as the land will also be a critical element of the environmental and amenity infrastructure for the airfield development, and that land would be returned to Whipple no later than open for traffic to enable it to be included in the residential scheme's first phase of Sangland. However, at this stage, key terms remain outstanding for the management agreement of this land. I will finish by saying that Whipple has no in-principle objection to the scheme. Indeed, delivered collaboratively, the DCO can deliver benefits to the airfield site. However, at present, the agreement that has been exchanged fails to provide comfort required that the applicant's proposals wouldn't stymie the development of the airfield. It remains Whipple's intention to secure an agreement with the applicant to ensure that there is confidence that removal of the objection to compulsory acquisition powers over the land will not prejudice the development proposals for the airfield. However, at this stage of the examination, and despite Whipple's recent efforts, the opportunity to secure an agreement seems to be fading. As such, Whipple maintains the objection to powers over its land and requests that it is recommended that powers are not granted. Whipple is intent on reaching an agreement with Highways England to ensure Highways England can deliver their scheme, while also ensuring the development of the airfield is not prejudiced. However, Highways England appear reluctant to provide the certainty required and are resolved to implement compulsory acquisition powers without restraint, regardless of the potential impact on the airfield proposals. It is Whipple's position that only in the absence of compulsory acquisition will Highways England engage meaningfully to reach a private treaty agreement. Apologies, I've gone a little over the 5 minutes.
Was Mr. Gould writing? I should say that's okay, Mr. Cunliffe. I should also give you our apologies as well for overrunning significantly this morning. When we set out our timings, obviously we'd never run virtual events before, so they do take considerably longer than a in the room event. I think that's part of it, and it was just a long session anyway. But our apologies for saying after 10:45 and it being significantly after 10:45.
That's completely all right and understood. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cunliffe. Mr. Humphreys, are you ready to give your response under agenda item 3, following the normal steps that you've already outlined in all of the other sessions, i.e. running through the statutory tests, human rights type matters, and then drawing any other considerations to our attention that you think are particularly significant with respect to this site?
Yes, sir, of course. So I'll just start by dealing with those matters you've drawn attention to. Obviously, what we're invited to do is set out our position in relation to the statutory and policy tests. The statutory tests, as you've heard me now say a few times, are principally set out in section 122 of the Act. We need to show that we require the land and that there is a compelling case in the public interest. We've set out in relation to each plot why we require the land in Appendix A to the statement of reasons. Some plots are required for the permanent and physical works, principally the Wisley Lane diversion. Some are required to construct that piece of infrastructure, but it will be, I think, by now clear to you that without all of those plots, it would not be possible to construct that part of the scheme, and without being able to construct the Wisley Lane diversion, the scheme, for all intents and purposes, would not be able to go ahead. Wisley Lane would be cut off at its southern extent by the widened A3, and there would be no access. We have to have that bridge, and the construction compound and the various other areas are required in order to carry out that construction work. We've set out again, you know, in our case, why we say that these aims in terms of the compulsory acquisition guidance tests are legitimate, necessary and proportionate. And I'll come to the point about proportionate, because that kind of touches on the very first thing that Mr. Cunliffe mentioned, which were concerns that the Wisley Airfield people have about the use of the compulsory acquisition powers. Obviously, we have been very careful to be proportionate. You can see how we've dealt with that in the statement of case. We've identified those areas where we have to have acquisition of freehold, where we can do with rights, and where we only need temporary possession. But you'll also obviously be familiar with the way in which the temporary possession power works in Article 32, that we may in some circumstances take temporary possession of land and only acquire the freehold or rights later. And that's an example of how the powers in fact have been constructed in a way in order to be proportionate. It would allow us, for example, to go on, carry out certain works. The design and the construction of those could mean, don't say would, but could mean that we didn't then need all of the land coloured pink, in which case we wouldn't need to acquire all of that land. And so we don't accept. I understand exactly Mr. Cunliffe's point, but we don't agree that the powers are inappropriate in that particular way. The second general point that Mr. Cunliffe came to was the point about the Wisley Lane access, and particularly some of the design points there. And it's important to recognise here that the Wisley Airport development doesn't have planning permission yet. It, to some extent, actually relies on the development which Highways England is carrying out, and indeed it's proposed that the access will come off our Wisley Lane diversion. If it was not for that, then the airfield would have to provide an entirely separate alternative access itself, and that may or may not be appropriate. Now, as far as key aspects of the design are concerned, clearly, as I've said to you on more than one occasion, sirs, the design will continue to develop. What we are trying to do through the various side agreements we've got, including with the Wisley Airport people, is to make sure that we are taking into account their concerns in the designs. And Mr. Cunliffe mentioned a number of those things, like, you know, wanting fibre optic cables and permeability for environmental reasons. You will know, sir, from the papers that the airfield allocation, it's anticipated that there will be a SANG instituted, and Wisley Airfield, the Wisley Airfield people are concerned to make sure that we do not compromise that. Well, sir, the simple answer on this is obviously we are constructing the Wisley Lane diversion for our purposes, for the purposes set out in the road investment strategy, and you know, in accordance with our own design. But we are very keen not to compromise other developments, and that's why we're willing to enter into negotiations and agreements, and that's why we have been doing that. But I'm afraid we're not having a piece of Highways England infrastructure in effect decided, and its design decided by an entirely private sector development that may or may not get planning permission adjoining it. And that, so it's not sort of parking tanks on the lawn. So that's just pointing out, as you would expect us to do as we're expending public money, that we will do what is necessary for our scheme, and we will not want to compromise the airport people, but we will want to work with them and try not to compromise what they want to do. And we think, despite what may have been said, we think we've had very helpful and constructive discussions actually on those things, and certainly the things that we think in terms of, for example, environmental permeability of the road. You will note, sir, that our own environmental statement, I give you just some examples, paragraph 7.10.43 of the biodiversity chapter, that's APP 052, and also paragraphs 7.4.37 and 40 of the same document talk about the sort of environmental things we intend to do in that area for our development, and those would be secured obviously through the REAC and therefore the CEMP, which is secured by requirement 3.2. So we're satisfied that the environmental measures that we require, using this as an example, are secured by the DCO. Now, insofar as the airport people may want things on top of that, we're very willing to cooperate, but obviously you will understand that is somewhat different to that. We're not acceding to some sort of mechanism being secured through the development consent order itself, but we are very willing to discuss that in an agreement, and even after the end of this examination to consider that. So that's our position on that second issue. The third issue that Mr. Cunliffe raised related to the compound. He made it very clear that he had no objection to the use of the large area of hard standing as a construction compound. They wanted, however, this, as he put it, yielded up as soon as possible. Believe me, sir, we have no desire to be on that particular piece of land longer than we need to, but it is an important element of the construction. We have taken the necessary powers that we need through the temporary possession powers in the DCO, but we're more than happy to discuss details with the airport people, and we are doing that. Again, impression given almost is that there is no meeting of minds. There are clearly things to resolve, but we are actually sorting many of those things out, we feel. I think the fourth area, if I've got it right, I think that was the third area. The fourth area, so related to, if my note is correct, kind of reinstatement type issues. And again, we need to reinstate that land in accordance with Article 32. So I do note that that is reinstatement. It is currently a piece of hard standing. There's no obligation on us in reinstating to in other words, sort of improve it to a standard that a developer wants for its development. Because if we weren't here at all, clearly the airport people would have to deal with that large area of hard standing itself. However, having said that, again, we do remain willing to discuss these sorts of things to make sure that we do not cause, you know, an unnecessary burden on the airport people, and those sort of things are being discussed. But strictly, the DCO in Article 32 does set out what is entirely conventional, entirely normal for all DCOs. There's nothing special there that reduces any burden on us, and we will reinstate in accordance with that. And it may be we do more through a side agreement, but that is a separate matter. The fifth point, sir, was Mr. Cunliffe very properly, and I'm grateful to him, made it very clear that Whipple has no in principle objection to the scheme. That's understood, as I said at the outset. In fact, the airfield development to some considerable extent relies on our development coming forward. We do not, however, rely on them coming forward. And therefore it's not surprising, and I'm grateful that they make it clear that they don't object in principle. Now, sir, I've dealt briefly with the things in your agenda item 2A, which were the statutory tests. I've responded to the points that Mr. Cunliffe made. I think there are the points on Human Rights Act type points. I think I can take it shortly. I reiterate our general position in relation to Article 1, Protocol 1. That's a qualified human right. What we're proposing, the improvement scheme, is in the public interest as far as Article 6 is concerned, and right to a fair hearing. That's exactly what we are having now, and obviously there are opportunities for written submissions to be made as well. So I think, sir, I've covered then all the points I've got available. I mentioned earlier Mr. Wade. I think I should correct myself. It's probably Ms. Christie, Laura Christie, who's been taking the lead on this and very involved in the discussion. So it may be that she wants to add something, although hopefully I've said all that needs to be said at this point. So those are the points I was going to make, and I'll now go dark, as they say.
Thank you, Mr. Humphreys. Miss Christie, is there anything that you think that Mr. Humphreys has obviously missed in what he's just presented? I mean, it might be that through the asking of my questions and the answering of my questions in agenda item 4, that matters that you might wish to add will come up anyway. But Miss Christie.
Laura Christie, Highways England. No, there's nothing further for me to add at this time that Mr. Humphreys hasn't already said.
Thank you. Then I think we will head straight into agenda item 4. I have to say, I don't actually have very many questions. First question is for both applicant and the airfield people. And I suspect, actually, in terms of the side agreement or the heads of term that go with the agreement, given what has been said in other sessions, that it might be Mr. Challis that pops up to give an indication of where progress is in terms of concluding the heads of terms that Mr. Cunliffe has referred to. So if I turn to the applicant first, whoever amongst the team can update us on what you think is a position in terms of the likely end date or concluding date for agreeing heads of terms.
Thank you, sir. Mark Challis for Highways England. Some of this has been covered in what Mr. Humphreys has just said, but heads of terms initially and latterly a full land and works agreement have been under discussion with Whipple for many months now. The issues are complex, but we are willing, as Mr. Humphreys said, to collaborate and cooperate with Whipple in the delivery of its scheme. We recognise that they wish to bring forward, when they get planning permission, a substantial scheme, and we don't want to make that difficult for them. But in terms of engagement, I think it is fair to point out that there was something of a gap in our dealings with Whipple whilst Taylor Wimpey acquired the company, and indeed we've only been dealing with the new professional team since late March, early April. But even so, we have made good progress on an agreement, and it does cover a number of things that one would expect a cooperation or a collaboration agreement to cover, such as the shared construction access issue, how the Wisley Lane diversion is designed in such the way that if Whipple want to take access from that road for their scheme, they're not put to disproportionate expense in doing so, arrangements for vacating the Wisley Lane worksite at the earliest opportunity, commensurate with the efficient delivery of the DCO scheme, detail about working methodology, as Mr. Humphreys mentioned, discussions about the permeability of the Wisley Lane diversion for species and how that is built into the design of the DCO scheme, taking into account what Whipple may need for their scheme in due course, keeping trees and vegetation that don't have to be removed for Highways England's purposes, such that they can form part of Whipple's scheme, arrangements for the maintenance of Stratford Brook and survey access and various other provisions. But that, I think, sir, gives you a sort of reasonable flavour of what the scope of the agreement will cover, and it hasn't really changed very much in scope since the summary we gave you at deadline 10, which is in fact paragraph 2.3 of Rep 10008. So discussions are continuing. As regards the more detailed land provisions, we only received those from Whipple in mid-May, but we are looking at those and all of the other issues, and we will make as much progress as we can and conclude the agreement if we can before the examination. But either way, sir, we will of course update you at the appropriate deadline so you know where things stand.
Thank you, Mr. Challis. I've seen Mr. Murray's hand up, so don't worry, Mr. Murray, we haven't forgotten you. I'm just going to push you, though, Mr. Challis, on when you think the heads of terms in particular will be agreed. What sort of level of confidence have you got at the moment that that might be secured by, well, the close of the examination, but really deadline 12, which is a couple of days before, i.e. the 10th of July?
So we've decided to move away from heads of terms and try and put in place a full-blown agreement. So that does make the job a bigger job. It's very difficult to say, of course, because it depends upon things being agreed. And but I think it's fair to say we're reasonably confident that we can agree something before the end of the examination. But you know, of course, both sides need to come together quickly on a number of the points that we've been discussing. But we will, of course, do our best.
Mr. Murray.
Thank you, sirs. It's really to present my apologies that unfortunately this has overrun rather, and I have another commitment, so I need to leave a couple of minutes ago. I think Mr. Cunliffe has my points, in fact, which I've sent to him. So I'd just like your permission to exit at this moment, if I may.
Of course.
Thank you.
So case team, please take this as Mr. Murray formally coming out of the meeting. Mr. Cunliffe, I presume in answering my question in terms of timescales, are you going to lead on that, or is somebody else in the team going to lead on that?
Ian Cunliffe, Gately Hamer. I can provide an initial response, but I think I'll probably turn to Mr. Courage to provide more detail. Everything that Mr. Chalice has set out is accurate in terms of what the Land and Works Agreement is seeking to achieve. I think our frustration is founded in the fact that the additional level of detail that we've sought to include within the Land and Works Agreement, which would make it contractually robust, has been challenged. And all we're seeking to do is understand how mechanisms are going to work in the future. We're not looking to have all the answers now, but we're looking to ensure that where we don't have answers, we have mechanisms so that both construction programs can run in parallel. The public money pointed that Mr. Humphreys raised is very relevant, and clearly there's the risk that where you've got a large development of the airfield running in parallel with Highways England scheme, if access as a key point is severed, then the clock is running in terms of the cost that would eventually go back to the taxpayer. So that is one of the key concerns that we have, which is what we're trying to mitigate through the Land and Works Agreement. And I think I'll just ask, if I may, whether Mr. Courage has anything to add as the holder of the pen in terms of the Land and Works Agreement.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. Yeah, I think it's been fairly summarised. I mean, we did start discussions, and we had a first meeting at the beginning of March. The reason I remember it was because it was just before lockdown. And we did return the initial draft mid-May, on the 15th of May, to Mr. Chalice, and we had a further version returned to us on the 9th of June, and I think that's where our frustration slightly lies. Is it was a mixture between comments and amendments, and various parts where I put in the details of the license arrangements to provide the certainty that Mr. Cunliffe has described, are still awaiting Highways England's or VOA's thoughts and comments. But we did have a helpful call last night at 6:30 with everyone, Highways England and Mr. Chalice, and we went through some of those sort of high-level points, and we've agreed that I will provide a further revised draft early next week, and we'll have got another call on, I think it's Friday next week, to go through that further revised draft. But we're just keen, and what I want to emphasise really is that everyone puts all their focus and efforts in trying to reach this side agreement as soon as possible, and obviously before the 10th of July, which will require, some immediate consideration by Highways England to the licence arrangements and how we're going to overcome making sure that we have access to the airfield throughout the duration of works. We've conceded the point that they might have some severance, but that severance needs to be described to our access. But that severance needs to be clearly set out in the side agreement as to the extent and how notice is provided, because we can't have severance going on for days or weeks. But we are willing to accommodate if there is temporary severance of, say, a couple of hours or a certain period of time. That then we can put the relevant methodology in the side agreement to deal with that.
Thank you, Mr. Courage. Mr. Jones, in terms of question 4A, where the side agreement is going, have you got anything to add in terms of further questions?
Nothing to add in terms of further questions, Mr. Gould. I'll pick that up in the action points at the end, though.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think we're going to gain much more by hearing from both sides. We understand the negotiations going on in the background. The rate of those negotiations are in the parties' hands. There's nothing that the examining authority can do about that. But we understand the position as you sit here today. So if I now turn to...
Just before you do, Mr. Gould, I'm just getting a message from the case team, which is why people might see me looking to my left like that. just to say that Mr. Pazaru seems to have either left. I don't know if that is of his own accord or he's dropped out. So I wondered if I could just ask somebody from the Wisley Airfield, were you planning on Mr. Pazaru speaking much today?
No.
Okay, so you're content to continue, Mr. Cunliffe, in Mr. Pazaru's absence?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Sorry, Mr. Gould, over to you.
Thank you. So if we now look at a question for the airfield people, in terms of timescales for the proposed commencement of the airfield development, can you give an indication of where you are? I mean, when is a planning application likely to be submitted to Guildford Borough?
Ian Cunliffe, Gately, Hamer. I have a response, but I don't know whether or not Mr. Davis would like to lead on that.
Yeah, absolutely. We are looking to submit 2 planning applications in September of this year. One for enabling works for SANG and the other for an access. We would be looking for an on-site start of March 21. For enabling works only, not for the development. The reason behind this is to enable the delivery of the A35 allocation and Guildford Borough's housing trajectory. You need to be able to have a certain logistical sequence of works to enable a SANG, which takes approximately 18 months to 2 years. And it's to do with cutting of grass to enable a SANG. So working those timescales back, we would need to be starting in March 21 to enable that development to happen. The main application for the proposed development, which would form a hybrid application for the outline for the whole of our title, and 400 units in detail, would be in March 21. So that would be the full planning permission submission.
So that's a full planning application for the actual main development in March 21, Mr. Davis. And just in terms of the not an outline, I'm correct in hearing
it would be a full detailed for 400 approximately units, and then an outline for the whole site.
Thank you. And in terms of the works you would need to do for the SANG, are you able to explain to us just exactly where within the site they would need to be?
Yeah, on the part of the allocation, there's an SPA to the north of the site. There is a boundary that we will need to plant effectively a SANG. Those works need to be complete upon first occupation. As I mentioned before, to enable the SANG to be established, which is part of the proposal and the pre-occupation conditions, it would need to be established. To be established, you would need 2 years worth of growth. So that means we would need to be on site on March next year.
Thank you. Mr. Gould, do you have anything to add on that point before I revert to you?
I don't, so I'm just completing my note. Apologies. Turning to the applicant, just having heard those timescales, can somebody from your team give an indication of just how much overlap there's likely to be? If those timescales are kept to, it sounds like there could well be a fair amount of overlap, because presuming the Secretary of State is minded to make an order, the order could be made somewhere, I suppose, towards the tail end of 2020, early 21.
Hello, James Lucchini, Balthwyddi Atkins. I think I can add some information, sirs, on that. So for the initial phase, this was briefly mentioned in the meeting last night. It seems to be fairly small scale access in and out, which I'm sure that we can accommodate without any problems. We don't yet have an understanding of when the main development will start, which will allow me to have a bit more of an answer, really.
Mr. Cunliffe, in terms of a possible start date for the construction of any houses, when do you think that might arise?
Mr. Davis, did you want to respond to that point? Apologies for introducing you.
I should say the examining authority doesn't mind who answers it. It's a question of whoever's best placed to do it.
Hello there.
Yeah.
Sorry, we would propose to start the main part of the works of the site in Jan 22. So that would be working our programme back from that. So Jan 22. What that enables us to do is to deliver in quarter one in 2023, which is in accordance with Guildford Borough's local plan trajectory.
Mr. Lucchini, given that Whipple believe that they would start, if like in earnest, on the main develop around about January 2022, in terms of the timescales that you're working to, where might that be in relation to the progress of the highway scheme?
James Uccini, Balfour Beatty Atkins. In January 2022, we would be progressing with the Wisley Lane diversion. I'd hope at that point we'd be fairly well progressed with it, which may suit actually if it's done in time and it all kind of dovetails together. Then access would be almost there on the Ockham Junction.
And in terms of the compound, thoughts on, and this is again for Mr. Lucchini or anybody else from the applicant's team, when do you think you would vacate the compound?
James Uccini, Balfour Beatty Atkins. We envisage the use of the compound throughout the scheme, and that would be until mid to end of 2023.
Okay, that's helpful in understanding how the two schemes might dovetail with one another. I think it would assist both the examining authority and probably the Secretary of State when he gets to read our recommendation, if we can ask that those timetabling matters be presented. Don't really, it can be either the airfield people or the applicant or jointly, but if you can just set a note out that just shows those key dates of when works might be coinciding with one another.
So I'm sure we can set out our dates, and I'm sure in cooperation with Mr. Cunliffe and his clients, we can produce something that kind of reflects their understanding as well. Take it that we will try to do that, but we obviously know our dates and they know their dates, so this should be possible.
Yeah, it's really just a question of bringing them together in one nice, neat note. I see, Mr. Courage, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, if I may, appreciate the compound will be used for the duration of the DCO scheme works, and it was suggested that would be the end of 2023. There just needs to be a clarification between we were expecting that when it's open for traffic, we've got it in the side agreement that 2 months after it's open for traffic, they'll no longer need the compound. So there just obviously needs to be that, and it's in that 2-month period where we're requiring some further consideration by Highways England in its use of the compound, so it doesn't prejudice the use of the SANG.
I understand the point, but I think that's a matter of detail for discussion between the parties, not something that the examining authority needs to get too waylaid with.
Okay.
Yes, the one thing we might just ask Mr. Lucchini to comment on is obviously the project, the Highways England project, is more than just the Wisley Lane diversion, and the compound is relevant for the project, and I assume we need the compound, but Mr. Lucchini can correct me on this, until the end of the project, not necessarily the Wisley Lane part of it, but that's just my understanding, and I may have that wrong, so maybe Mr. Lucchini just needs to comment on that.
James Lucchini, Balfour Beatty Atkins. Yes, that's correct. It would be for the whole scheme, not the part of the scheme just covering Wisley diversion.
And Mr. Lucchini, while you're there, when do you anticipate on the programme that you're working to at the moment that the whole scheme would be complete?
Oh, I've got a bit of a mind freeze here. I can't be. It is the end of 2023. I can't remember which month. I apologise.
All right, yeah. But by that sort of time, say somewhere in the middle of 2023, what level of activity is likely on the compound at that point? I mean, would it still be fairly significant use, or is it a much reduced level of activity?
James Lucchini, Balfour Beatty Atkins. The level of activity mid 2023 would be kind of similar as during the main part of the scheme, because that area is used for material processing. There's some storage of traffic management which will be carried on through the scheme. The area which wouldn't be required is the structures work site, because the bridge will already been constructed, and there will still need to be some welfare arrangements where our hands are somewhat tied by the fact that this is one of the few areas that's not within an SBA. Hence its use.
Thank you. Mr. Jones, have you got any questions on timing type matters? The dovetailing of the two projects?
No, I think they've all been answered.
Thank you.
As far as they can in the current situation.
And really the last question that I think that I've certainly got, it really revolves around, in simple or crude terms, how much tripping up might there be of one project versus the other project in terms of the temporary access arrangements? Mr. Lucchini, do you want to start and then we'll hear from the airfield people in response.
Yes, sir. James Uccini of Alpha Beta Atkins. It's my belief that there shouldn't be too much tripping over each other, and we believe that we can work together, and we don't consider ourselves a blocker. We will accommodate wherever possible.
Lee Davis, Taylor Wimpey. I agree with James's comments as long as we can get certainty on it.
Thank you, Mr. Cunliffe, and thank you, Mr. Lucchini. Mr. Jones, is there anything that you want to add on that sort of temporary access situation and how things might interrelate with one another?
Just in terms of the actual physical access or accesses required, would it be one access in that then splits off into different areas, or would they be two separate accesses to keep the two lots of construction traffic separate? Or have you not worked out exactly how your shared access would work should shared access be required?
Lee Davis. Oh,
sorry, Lee, you go ahead.
Lee Davis, Taylor Wimpey. It can be done in a multitude of ways: single access maintained by traffic management, or two separate accesses. So it's certainly feasible either way.
Okay, thank you. I take it that answers for you as well, Mr. Lucchini, or is there anything else you wish to add on that point?
No, I think Lee covered it well.
Okay, thank you.
Ian Cunliffe from Gately Hamer. Just to add, clearly we're relaxed in what form that access might take, but what we are conscious of is within Change 9, there has been no provision for access into the airfield. So what we're looking for is just to identify areas or mechanisms for confirming an access can be provided. So that is the nature of the sort of things that we're looking to incorporate within the Land and Works Agreement. And where we don't have a solution, then we're looking for mechanisms to identify an alternative.
Thank you, Mr. Cunliffe. No further questions from me. Over to you, Mr. Gould.
Yeah, and similarly, no further questions from me. So really, we are now at the point where we're at agenda item 5, which is really the airfield people's final comment. In making final comments, it would assist, I think, the examining authority to understand precisely that if by the close of the examination there hasn't been an agreement arrived at, precisely which plots or all of the plots you would be objecting to. Now, you may not be able to answer that question now. If you feel you can't answer that question or comment on it in your final remarks, then maybe go away, think about it, and put it in a note that you're going to be preparing anyway to summarise what's been said this morning, this afternoon, I should say. Mr. Cunliffe, are you going to do that closing comments, or somebody else from the team?
I should just interject and say that's agenda item 4.
Well, final closings 5.
Yes, yeah. Not on the agenda I've got. I've got it down as 4.
Yeah, I'm the same, sir. I've just assumed that there are two different versions.
4 questions were 4. 5 is the final right of reply. But what I'm really asking for in the final right of reply is that the Whipple people make it clear that if there's no agreement by the close of the examination what their position is vis-a-vis the plots of land that they've identified as being subject to objection at the moment, whether that will be all the plots, some of the plots, or just to have clarity. Now, if that's something you're not certain about in terms of being able to answer now, let's say that's something that could be held over to the written note post hearing.
Ian Cunliffe, Gately Hamer on behalf of Whipple. We understand the question. We'll take that away. I think my initial thoughts are the issues that we've flagged today are relevant to all the plots, but we will consider it further in
really what I'm
our
thinking
next response.
It might be that in the coming weeks there are certain matters that you've still disagreed about, but as you negotiate further, some matters might have been agreed. So a position statement will say, well, matters X, Y, and Z have been agreed, and the implications are that plots, whatever, aren't objected to anymore, but we still have a fundamental objection to whatever the residual plots might be. Is that clearer?
That is, yes, thank you. I mean, as a closing summary, our position remains that we're willing to work with Highways England. It's been made clear by the applicant, and there are benefits to our proposals arising out of the scheme, and what we want to do is make sure that those benefits are realised and they're not compromised. So we accept that for the duration of Highways England's development that we will be adopting a subordinate role, but what we will continue to try to do is maintain momentum on the agreement, which we feel has slowed, to ensure that there are the relevant safeguards in place to ensure that we can withdraw our objection, which is clearly where we'd like to be. But even in the absence of powers, if there were no compulsory acquisition powers promoted, we would still be working with Highways England to reach an agreement. And we're not seeking to take an unfair commercial advantage out of the proposals at all. We just want to have a collaborative working arrangement with Highways England.
Thank you, Mr. Cunliffe. I presume those are your concluding remarks. You've got nothing further to add. If that's the case, that will conclude agenda item 5. I'll hand over to Mr. Jones for agenda item 6.
Thank you, Mr. Gould. I think I've solved the mystery of the difference between the agenda items. What we've done on this agenda, we haven't put the welcome and introductions as agenda item 1, which is what we've done for every other session. But so we're effectively one out. So actually on the published agenda, this is actually agenda item 5, but I'm sure we all know what we mean anyway. In terms of action points, I only have 2, and the first action point I've got is for the either a confirmation that the land and works agreement has been sorted out and signed between the parties. Presumably that we would leave you as long as possible on that. So that would be deadline 12, Friday the 10th of July, or should that agreement not be reached, we would need a position statement from both sides on exactly where you are at close of play of the examination. As we've said many times now, before anything that comes in once the examination closes, we can't take account of. So we will need that by deadline 12, please. Or hopefully you will have managed to reach agreement by then, and you just need to notify us of that. And then the other matter, by deadline 11, if possible, please, would be this issue about the presentation of the timetable and matters in a note showing the key envisaged dates and the interrelationship between the two. So Whipple's dates and the applicant's dates. Those are the only 2 action points I've got arising from this final session, unless anybody else has got any.
Nothing from me, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. I see general silence and no hands up, so I shall.
I don't think so, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Humphreys. Just before we close this session, and indeed the CA hearing in its entirety, is there anything else that anybody wishes to say or add before I move to a close?
So I was just going to say, probably on everyone's behalf, how grateful we all are for the way you've conducted this. I know it's all very new and very different, and also behind the scenes, you know, Eleanor and KJ and so on. We're very, very grateful for the way we've been treated. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Humphreys. I was actually going to come on you with almost psychic powers of ability. You came on to you've managed to come on to my closing comments. And first of all, I should say, just for the record, that clearly we had a reserve week of next Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, the 23rd, 24th, and 25th of June. They were in the examination timetable. Clearly, we've managed to get through everything in this week, so it will not be necessary to hold any of those reserve sessions. I'm sure we're all very pleased about that, so I can stand everybody down for next week, which is great news for all of us, I'm sure. And rather unusually, I would like to say a few thank yous, actually. And as Mr. Humphreys has alluded to, clearly we were scheduled to hold this session or sessions in March. And clearly, since then, the world's changed somewhat, and we've had to move to a virtual hearing environment. And in order to get us to this virtual hearing environment, a number of members of what I call my team, i.e. Mr. Gould and Ms. Church, Mr. Johansson, have put in some very long hours to get us here. And also there have been a number of people in PINS the IT people, and I should give particular mention to Mr. Ryn Smith, who some of you may well know, have really put in a lot of work behind the scenes just to get us to this virtual hearing, you know, to prep for that, to run dummy events, just so we're as up to speed as we can be, and to really look at the technology. So a significant amount of work has gone on behind the scenes in regards to you know, the virtual sessions, and of course we've had the help, the brilliant help for the last few days from Ms. Patton and Mr. Price in terms of running the documents and dealing with all the other matters. So again, that's really much appreciated. And of course, not only have we put in some long hours, I'm well aware that the applicants team, no doubt you've been burning the midnight oil as well, Mr. Humphreys, and all of your colleagues from Highways England, and indeed all the affected persons that have taken part these last few days. So really, I would like to thank all of you for all the hard work you've put in throughout the course of the examination, for the way you've all conducted yourselves. It really is appreciated by Mr. Gould and myself. And we do appreciate all the hard work you've put in meeting all the deadlines. So really, it just then leaves me to say, on behalf of the examining authority, I'd like to wish you all a very good remainder of the summer. Most importantly, I think we hope that everybody stays safe and well in these times. So I can now say the time is now 1:33 and session 2, part 2, and indeed all of this compulsory acquisition hearing is now closed. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.